Hey everybody, what's going on? This is Sam from Historic Travels and welcome to another video. And as always, before we get started today, I'd just like to take a quick moment to welcome all my new subs and to thank everybody who's been leaving me comments and messages down below. Thank you all so much, I really appreciate it. And if you would like to take a couple of extra steps to help support the channel a little bit more, there's a merch store and a Patreon for this channel in the links below. Thank you all so much for all your support. Alright guys, so in past videos we have discussed in detail some of the incredible stories of some of the children who were on board the Titanic on its maiden voyage. We've talked about Lorraine Allison, we talked about Eva Hart, just to give a few examples. But what if I was to tell you that there were two children, brothers in fact, who were on board the RMS Titanic during its maiden voyage, and these children were the victims of a kidnapping attempt? Yes, you heard me right. There were two children on board the Titanic who were, at the time that they were on board the ship, literally being kidnapped. So, that's the story we are going to be talking about in today's video, and without any further ado, let's get into it. The names of the two children who were being kidnapped on board the Titanic were Michel Novotil, who can be seen on the left side of this photo, and his younger brother Edmund, who can be seen on the right side of this photo. At the time of the Titanic's maiden voyage, Michel was nearly 4 years old, while his younger brother Edmund had just turned 2 years old. The father of the two boys was named Michel Novotil, same name as the firstborn son. His wife and the boy's mother's name was Marcel Novotil. However, for the purpose of this video, we're going to be focusing on Michel Novotil, because he would be the one who ultimately decided to attempt to kidnap the two children. Now, before we go into the story of what ultimately happened to the two boys when the Titanic was sinking, I first need to give you a little bit of the backstory of their parents. And now, because Michel and his firstborn son both share the same name, I wanted to let you all know that, unless I state otherwise, if I use the name Michel, I'm referring to the dad, not the oldest son. Alright, now that we got that out of the way, let's continue the video. Michel Novotil moved to the city of Nice, France in the year 1902, at which point in time he proceeded to open up and run a tailor shop. Now, for the next several years, his business ran pretty well, but at some point between the years 1902 and the year 1907, he met a woman by the name of Marcel Corretto, at which point the two of them began to date. In the year 1907, Michel and Marcel ended up getting married, and then over the course of the next 3 years, the two of them would have two sons, the oldest being named Michel, and the second born would be named Edmund. Now, at some point in the year 1911, Michel's tailor business began to struggle. Business just wasn't what it used to be. And also right around this same time, Michel and Marcel began to have difficulties with their marriage. Now, in early 1912, Michel and Marcel ultimately decided to end their marriage, and the two of them got a divorce. Michel claimed that this was because he discovered that Marcel was having an affair with another man, although how true this is open to debate. I couldn't really find any information on this, so I'll leave it up to you to decide your opinion on that. So ultimately, the two of them ended their marriage, and Michel's tailor business ended up shutting down. Now, as part of the terms of the divorce, Marcel was given ultimate custody of their two children, and Michel was allowed to visit the children on weekends. This was a decision that Michel did not like. And because of this decision, Michel began to put a plan into action at which he would ultimately decide to try and kidnap his two sons. With his marriage officially over and his business bankrupt, Michel didn't see a point in remaining in France any longer, so he began to formulate a plan. He decided to try his luck by immigrating to the United States. However, he didn't want to take this journey by himself, and since he disagreed with the court's decision to give custody of his two children to his ex-wife, he decided to try to kidnap his two kids and take them with him when he decided to immigrate to the United States. Michel's plan to kidnap the two boys went along like this. He would wait until the weekend, at which point in time he would be allowed to have custody of the two kids. And then he would simply take the two kids and leave France and head for America, and that's all there is to it. And this is exactly what he did. On April 5th, 1912, which happened to be on a Friday, he went to his ex-wife's house, picked up the two boys, and then they all headed back to his place. The two boys were going to spend this weekend with him, and this happened to be Easter weekend. And then he simply just packed up, and then they headed for England to try to find a ship to head to America. Now, Marcel didn't realize that Michel and the two boys were gone until the following Monday, at which point she panicked and let the police know that her ex-husband had just kidnapped her two children. However, by the time Marcel had discovered that her two sons were missing and reported it to the French authorities, it was well too late. Michel was already well on his way to the city of London with their two sons in tow. Michel's first stop upon leaving Nice, France was Monte Carlo, at which point he would spend several days there. And then he left Monte Carlo and sailed to the city of London, where he hoped he could arrange further transportation for himself and his sons to the United States of America. During Michel's journey to London, he did not let the two boys out of his sight. He was terrified that somebody would discover his secret and report him to the police. Once they got to the city of London, Michel and the two boys stayed at Charing Cross Hotel, and it was also around this time that Michel arranged further transportation from London to the United States. He visited the White Star Line office and discovered that the RMS Titanic was getting ready to depart Southampton bound for New York City, so he decided to book passage on this vessel to take him and his two sons to America. He purchased 3 second-class tickets, and during his registration on board the Titanic, he wrote down a fake name. That way nobody would be able to identify him should the police come and search the Titanic for him. He registered his name on board the Titanic under the name Louis Hoffman. Then he registered his two sons on board the Titanic under the name Louis and Lola Hoffman. His story was, if anybody should ask, that he was a single father and that these two boys' mother had passed away sometime before the sailing of the Titanic's maiden voyage. On April 10, 1912, operating under this fake name, Michel successfully made it to Southampton with his two sons, and all three of them successfully managed to board the Titanic, and then at 12 noon on April 10, 1912, the RMS Titanic steamed out of Southampton, bound for the United States. So up to this point, Michel's attempt to kidnap his two children had been completely successful, and at this point in time, he was now on his way to the United States with his two sons by his side. Throughout the Titanic's maiden voyage, Michel kept up his standard behavior of hardly ever letting the two boys out of his sight because he was still terrified, even as the Titanic was sailing across the Atlantic, that somebody on board the ship would discover his secret and report him. The only time he would ever let the boys leave his side is sometimes in the evening he would like to go and play cards, and he met a new friend on board the Titanic who he didn't care to let watch the boys while he played cards for a couple of hours. This was the only instance that he ever left the boys alone throughout the Titanic's maiden voyage. And then, as we all know, on the night of April the 14th, 1912, at 11:40 p.m., RMS Titanic struck an iceberg on the starboard side below the waterline and slowly began to sink. Now, not long after the Titanic had struck the iceberg, Michel went to his cabin and got his two sons up out of bed, and with the help of some of the Titanic's crew members, got them up to the boat deck where he would attempt to get them into one of the Titanic's all too few lifeboats. However, despite Michel getting his two sons up to the Titanic's boat deck early in the sinking, he was unable to find a spot for them in one of the Titanic's lifeboats until very close to the end of the Titanic's life. Now, honestly, this doesn't make any sense to me. I don't understand how this man could have two small children on the Titanic's boat deck throughout the entire course of the evening and not be able to get them into one of the Titanic's lifeboats. If any, and I mean any of the Titanic's officers saw these two small kids, they wouldn't hesitate to put them into one of the Titanic's lifeboats. The only explanation that makes somewhat sense to me is maybe these two children were kept on the Titanic due to the father's own selfish wishes. Maybe he did not want these two children to leave the Titanic without him. And then, as he saw the Titanic's life was about to end, he decided to just say whatever and get them into the last lifeboat to leave the Titanic. Honestly, this is a very selfish move from the father's part, but given his behavior throughout this entire story, honestly, this explanation does make sense to me, and I wouldn't put it past him to try something like this. However, Michel was ultimately able to save his two small boys by getting them a seat in the very last lifeboat to leave the Titanic by means of the ship's davits. The two small boys were saved in collapsible lifeboat D, which left the Titanic at roughly 2:05 a.m., around 15 minutes before the Titanic would take its final plunge. Now, Michel was ultimately unable to board this lifeboat, and he would lose his life when the RMS Titanic went down. Michel, his younger son who was in the lifeboat, said later in life that as his lifeboat was pulling away from the Titanic, he recalled hearing his dad shout out one last message to him. His dad said, "My child, when your mother comes for you, as she surely will, tell her that I loved her dearly and still do. Tell her I expected her to follow us so that we all might live happily together in the peace and freedom of the new world." I'm sorry, what did you just say? Did you just say that you hoped that their mother would follow you and your kids to America and you would all live happily there together? Well, I can tell you one thing. She's definitely going to follow you to the New World, but it's going to be to get the kids back that you kidnapped. Okay. For those of you who can't tell, I'm raging at Michelle right now. I'm not. All right, so just bear that in mind. But honestly, how selfish can you be? I honestly believe that my theory earlier about why these kids were kept on the Titanic so long is now accurate because of this comment you made. Honestly, you kept your kids on the Titanic so long just because you didn't want them to leave without you. I mean, you're their father. It is your job to make sure your kids are safe, then you try to save yourself. I mean, to be perfectly honest with you, I'm surprised you were even willing to let these kids go in Collapsible D. I mean, it's a good thing you saved your kids, but it's a horrible job being a parent by letting the kids be in that much danger in the first place. I mean, anyway, so... Okay, Sam, stop raging. I've had my rage moment, and I just can't believe somebody would do that. I mean, I'm glad the two boys made it, that's for darn sure. They should have never been in that situation in the first place. They shouldn't have been kidnapped, and the dad should have put them in the very first lifeboat he could as soon as the Titanic hit the iceberg.
A few hours after the Titanic went down, the Carpathia arrived on scene and began recovering the Titanic's lifeboats. Michelle and Edmund were successfully rescued from Collapsible D and brought on board the Carpathia. Once on board the ship, the Carpathia's crew were having a difficult time in dealing with these two small boys because they did not speak any English. They only spoke French. However, a Titanic passenger by the name of Margaret Hayes, who spoke French, volunteered to help take care of these two small children. Once the Carpathia arrived in New York City, Margaret Hayes even volunteered to shelter these two kids while their family members were located.
In the days following the Titanic disaster, local newspapers began running images of these small boys in an attempt to find any member of these children's family. There were some people in New York City who volunteered to adopt these two small children, should no family member be found. There was one man who lived in Iowa who believed that these two small children were his sons because every single member of this man's family was sailing to America on the Titanic. However, what this man didn't know is that every single member of his family lost their lives when the Titanic went down. Once he came from Iowa to New York and saw these boys for himself, and once he realized that these boys weren't his, he returned to Iowa without them. Now, eventually, Marcelle, who was still in France, would see a picture of her sons in the newspaper, at which point she proceeded to the White Star Line office and told them that she was their mother, so the White Star Line paid for her to have a round-trip ticket from France to New York, where she would be reunited with her two small boys. She got her boys back on May 16, 1912, 1 month and 1 day following the Titanic disaster. Once she was reunited with her two small children, they proceeded to the White Star Line dock in New York City, at which point they boarded the Oceanic to return back home to France. Anyway, guys, that's it for this video. Thank you all so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed it and found it interesting. And yeah, now you know the story of the two small children who were victims of a kidnapping and were on board the RMS Titanic when the ship went down. Oh, one thing I didn't mention in this video is that these two children are often referred to today as the Titanic orphans because they were the only children to survive the sinking of the Titanic without a parent or guardian present. So, fun fact. But yeah, and can you just honestly imagine how Marcelle must have felt when she saw her two small kids in that newspaper? I mean, I'm sure she was happy that her two small children were found and were okay. But can you imagine how she must have felt when she realized that they were on board the Titanic? I mean, I honestly can't even imagine what she must have felt when she realized that. But at least the family was able to be reunited and she was able to live with her children once again, and they were successfully returned to her, so that's good. Anyway, guys, thank you all so much for watching. Be sure to leave a like, be sure to subscribe, and I'm going to try to have one more video up before Christmas, so watch out for that. But if that doesn't happen, I'm going to go ahead and take a moment to wish you all a happy holiday, and thank you all so much for all the support that you've done throughout the course of this year. And guys, just without the support of all of you, I would not be able to do this for a job, so your support means more than you know. All right, everybody, well, hey, I'm wishing you all a happy holiday, and I will see you all in the next one. Have a good day, everybody.
Hey, if you like the Historic Travels YouTube channel, make sure you check out the Tales of the Protectors book series. Almost Heaven is Part 1 and The Elephant Path is Part 2. This is a young adult adventure series, and if you'd like the Chronicles of Narnia books, you will love these books. You can check out these books in the link in the description below. Special thanks to our Captain level Patreon supporters, Olivia Julius, Canadian, Greg Gatlick, and Callum Whaley. Thank you all so much for all the support.